This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is 1 Kings, chapter 18, verses 20 to 35. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on August 17, 2025. It's part of our series called Water and Spirit, about peace in the midst of an ever-changing world. I'll be reading from the 2020 revision of the New American Standard Bible, beginning at 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 20. So Ahab sent orders among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Then Elijah approached all the people and said, "How long are you going to struggle with the two choices? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him so much as a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left as prophet for the Lord, while Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now have them give us 2 oxen, and have them choose the one ox for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare another ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put fire under it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people replied, "That's a good idea." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose the one ox for yourselves and prepare it first, since there are many of you, and call on the name of your God, but put no fire under the ox." Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped about the altar which they had made. And at noon Elijah ridiculed them, saying, "Call out with a loud voice, since he is a god. Undoubtedly he is attending to business, or is on the way, or is on a journey. Perhaps he is asleep and will awaken." So they cried out with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out on them. When midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come forward to me." So all the people came forward to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. Then Elijah took 12 stones, corresponding to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he laid out the wood, and he cut the ox in pieces and placed it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." So they did it a second time. Then he said, "Do it a third time." So they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. Such a rich text, one of the more well-known stories in the book of 1 Kings. The book of Kings in Hebrew are actually just one book, Kings and Chronicles. But when they translated these 2 books out of Hebrew into Greek, the Greek lettering took a lot more space than the Hebrew lettering did, and so they had to split it into 2 different scrolls. So that's why Kings, instead of being one book, is 1 Kings and 2 Kings, and the same with Chronicles. Now, this story being well known in 1 Kings, which chronicles, of course, the kings of Judah and Israel after the time of the death of Solomon, are important books for us as they continue forward in that history. After recording the death of David, Solomon's reign, Solomon's death, and how the kingdom split in civil war between the 10 northern tribes, which became known as Israel, and the two southern tribes, which became known as Judah. So Israel in the north with 10 tribes, Judah in the south with 2 tribes, and these two kingdoms were separate and had separate rulers over them. So let's get all of our characters straight as we look at the first few verses here. First, there's Ahab in this story. He is the king of Israel. Remember, that's the northern kingdom of Israel, not Judah, not where Jerusalem is located, but the northern kingdom of Israel. Ahab is married to his queen, and her name is Jezebel. Jezebel is Ahab's wife. She is not Jewish and is a worshiper of Baal, all of which Ahab knew when he married her. Now, more about Baal in a moment. But let's continue. There's Elijah, who is the prophet of God sent to Israel who has lost their way. These stories that we read here are post-David and post-Solomon, but they are before the conquest of Israel by the Assyrian Empire in 722. So most scholars believe that Solomon's death was probably somewhere around 980 to 960 BCE, and that the northern kingdom of Israel then came into existence at that time and lasted for about 220, 230 years until it was taken by the Assyrians in 722. Now, Ahab, it says in the story, assembles all of the people of Israel at Mount Carmel. If you've ever been there, there's a statue this day outside the monastery there of Elijah wielding a knife, which comes much later in the story, even past what we're reading today, but is a part of the same story. And Mount Carmel overlooks a valley, and the valley it overlooks is the valley of Megiddo today, which is according to what we read in the book of Revelation and other parts of Scripture where the battle of Armageddon or Megiddo is to take place. Now, in addition to Ahab being there, all of the prophets of Baal are there. Now, what's not clear is whether or not these are Israelites who became priests of Baal, or whether these are Canaanites who have historically worshipped Baal that Ahab is simply brought into service as his own priests. So Elijah appears before this assembly that Ahab is called together, and he asks a strange question, and it's this: how long are you going to struggle between two choices? That word for struggle in Hebrew literally means limp. How long are you going to limp between two choices? The Israelites in this story were trying to have it both ways. They were laying claim to being the people of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and Baal. So the Israelites were leading a life that was polytheistic. In other words, they believed in many gods, of which Baal was one and Yahweh was another. And what Elijah tells them to do is essentially choose one or the other. And when he tells them to make their choice, it says in the text that they offer no response. Whether they're sheepish or whether they don't want to answer, who knows? Maybe they feel like the choice that's being given to them is a false choice, that why do I have to choose between two when both of them can be real? And there's also Ahab and Jezebel's power at work here. Obviously, they've enforced a way of life where there is Baal worship and some still worship of Yahweh. And so to make a choice in every way would be to defy their own king. So Elijah then states that he alone is left of the prophets of the Lord, but Baal has 450 prophets. And this is one of Elijah's first affirmations in his story of his prophetic office. He calls himself a prophet of the Lord. Now, it wouldn't have been uncommon for a king to be surrounded by prophets. And in the case of the kings of Judah, some of whom were idolatrous, but others of whom had a deep sense of fidelity to the God of David and the covenant that they had been a part of, they would surround themselves with prophets. So Elijah states not only are there 450 prophets of Baal, but that he's the only prophet left of the Lord in all of Israel. It's a condemning statement. It all opens us up to a key passageway, and it's this: that fidelity to God requires a singular focus. Fidelity to God requires a singular focus. The test that's going to be proposed here in a moment is not so much about God versus Baal, but more a vindication of Elijah's work as the prophet of Yahweh. He is a prophet of singular focus, that Yahweh alone is God and Baal isn't real. Baal's an imposter. So by worshiping both, Elijah suggests that the people are limping. At the heart of the message is that there are actions that are consistent with the worship of God. That if you're going to worship a God, there's actions that go along with it. So the people, by their silence to his question, have taken a passive role. They are not actively worshiping either. So at no point do we hear about the Israelites worshiping Baal in mass, at least up to this part of the story. That will change later in 1st and 2nd Kings. It's really Ahab and Jezebel that have really brought this influence of Baal back into the community. So when we think about how fidelity to God requires a singular focus, we must take care to observe the very same truths, that a rejection of false gods and taking up actions consistent with Yahweh, the God of Elijah, are our way of life. That we don't live in a world where there are many gods, of which our God is one. We live in a world in which our God alone is God, and everything else that claims to be God is an imposter. And that requires, at times from us, that singular focus. Now in verses 23 and 24, Elijah decides to come up with a solution for this indecision that the Israelites are having. So he proposes a solution. And the solution is this, that they're to secure 2 oxen, and they each get to pick one. The prophets of Baal get to pick one, and Elijah gets to pick one. But Elijah gives them all the odds. They go pick the 2 ox, they decide which one they want to use, whatever happens. Now, once the ox is cut up into pieces, they're to place it on a pile of wood, but they are to put no fire under it. So this is intended to be a burnt offering. But Elijah's clear, don't light a fire under it. And Elijah, he will do the same with his ox, which is going to be supplied by them. And he's going to build an altar out of wood and then place the ox pieces on top of it, but he's not going to bring a fire to put on it. The test is for each of them to call on the name of their God to see who sends fire down from heaven. He says, the God who answers by fire, he is God. That's a telling conclusion. Which God here will act? And how will the people act when that God acts? So their response is clear in verse 24. They say, this is a good idea. So they agree to the test. It's still not clear in the story whether the people were wholesale given over to the worship of Baal. Maybe they're just as interested in the question as Elijah is. We don't know. The text is not crystal clear about that. But this all opens up another key passageway to us, that we need to create opportunities for God to be great. Create opportunities for God to be great. While we all might like to see such powerful evidence for God's existence as this, there's more here than what meets the eye. I mean, how often do we give the space and time for God to do something great? Life often is so managed and routine that God has little time to do something remarkable. This does not mean that we put God to the test. Rather, that we do not shy away from the windows of opening for God to work. That if we want the Lord lifted up in our lives, there has to be space and time for that to happen. So we can ask that question, how are we creating opportunities for God's greatness? Well, in verses 25 to 29 of this story, we read about Baal's vacation. So Elijah gives the prophets of Baal the first option. They get to pick their own oxen. They get to pick whichever one they want. They get to go first and end all the speculation about whose God is real. So they prepared the ox, they placed it on the altar, and they began to pray. It says from morning until noon. And as they did so, they cried out, "O Baal, answer us." And it says in the text that they limped about the altar. Now that word for limped is the same Hebrew word that Elijah used back in verse 20 when he asked whether the people were going to limp along in their indecision about which God they were going to serve. Now by noon, Elijah begins to ridicule them. And before we get into the ridiculing, let's learn a little bit about Baal. Baal is the Canaanite god in the ancient Near East of the storm, of lightning, and rain. So if Baal can do anything, it's at least to be able to summon lightning, like fire from the sky. We know from other texts that are in Ugaritic, another ancient Near Eastern language, that Baal, like many of the ancient Near Eastern gods, would sleep. Baal would go on adventures. Baal would leave and not be present from time to time. Sometimes Baal is there, sometimes not. And that's kind of key to what happens next. Elijah knows this narrative about Baal. So he goads them on and he says, why don't you guys all cry out louder? Maybe he's not hearing you. And then he really gets colorful. He says, perhaps he's attending to business. That's how the New American Standard Bible translate this. Jewish scholars take this to mean that Baal is defecating, that he is gone to the restroom. He's busy. Maybe he's gone on a journey. Elijah says, maybe he's gone on another adventure. And then finally he says, maybe Baal is asleep. And if you're just a little louder, maybe you'll be able to wake him up. Well, the prophets of Baal take the bait and they cry out louder and louder. And then they begin to engage in what we know is Baal's funeral dirge. They start cutting themselves with swords and lances until blood is gushing out. This is all designed to get Baal's attention, to wake him up from his sleep or wherever he's gone. Well, they continued doing this for the afternoon up until the ritual evening sacrifice to Yahweh. There was an evening sacrifice every day that was to be made to Yahweh, the God of Elijah, and they did this all the way up until that time. And then this text tells us in verse 29 in a very condemning tone that after they did all of this, there was no voice that answered them, there was no answer that came from heaven, and that no one paid attention. It's a key passageway for us, in that idolatry is almost always more smoke than fire, appearance more than substance. You know, Baal was one of the native Canaanite gods in the ancient Near East, and the myth around Baal had been around for centuries. There were other ancient Near Eastern gods like Anu, Enki, Dagon. They all commanded the religion of the ancient Near East. Now, each of these gods in the ancient Near East paid little attention to humans, and that their interactions with humans were incidental. These gods would act for themselves, and they would rarely act for the benefit of humans in creation. These gods that the ancient Near Eastern peoples believed in lacked presence, they lacked attention. This was all normal. The gods were busy doing something, and the prophets of Baal know this, and that's why they keep trying time and again to get Baal's attention. And when we think about the idols of our day, they're the same, aren't they? Greed, power, brazen ambition, wealth, all of them are hollow, they're fleeting. Their appearance on the outside is attractive. I mean, after all, it's attractive for them to pray to Baal, the one who sends the rain and the storm and the lightning and the thunder. Of course they would. But what we find when we look closely at this story and we look closely at our own lives, that these gods have no care for us. These ancient Near Eastern gods didn't care for human beings, much in the same way that greed doesn't care, power doesn't care, brazen ambition doesn't care. They're all indifferent. So no matter what we cry out for, they will not respond. The Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1, that people exchange the worship of the one true God to worship sticks and stones. It's such a condemning statement by Paul about how our choices for idolatry in every way make no sense at all. Well, finally, we turn to Elijah's preparation for what's going to happen in verses 30 to 35. Now, Elijah, he goes to great lengths to help the people see that Yahweh is alive and present, that his God is not on a vacation, not on an adventure, and that the symbolic acts that Elijah takes as he sets up for what's going to happen are so important. We focus often on his prayer and the fire that comes down from heaven, and that happens in verses 36 to 39. Don't focus on that yet. We're not even reading that as part of the passage today. And it's not because it's not an important part of the story, but we're not reading it because we read past these important things that Elijah does. The first thing he does, it says in verse 30 and 31 that he restores the altar of Yahweh and includes 12 stones representing the 12 tribes. Now, these people always claimed to be the nation of Israel. They called themselves Israelites. But what Elijah does in this story as he sets up the altar is he reminds them of who they are. You see, he says that these 12 stones represent the 12 tribes. He reminds them that these 12 stones of the 12 tribes were once sons of Jacob, whom God changed Jacob's name into Israel. Their name as Israelites comes from this story. So as Elijah begins building the altar, he's reminding them of who they are. It's a statement about their national identity, the people whom they descended from, who they are. It says that he built this altar in the name of the Lord for God's own purpose. Such an important symbolic act he takes. Second, he digs a trench around the altar that he's built big enough to hold 2 measures of seed. So he's basically built a moat around this altar. It says that he cuts up the wood and piles it on top of the altar he's built, and then he cuts up the ox and he places the ox on top of the piles of wood. Then the fourth thing he does, and this is again symbolic, he takes 4 large jugs of water and he has them poured over the sacrifice 3 different times. So do your simple math here. 4 jugs of water 3 times. How many jugs of water got poured over that thing? 12. The same number as the stones he used to rebuild the altar, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, who are the 12 sons of Jacob, who is Israel. There's so much water that the ox and the wood are soaked, and the trench is filled with water. And that takes us to our final key passageway. It's this, that God's movement overcomes every obstacle. God's movement overcomes every obstacle. Elijah's setup reinforces the national identity of the Israelites, which Baal's prophets could not do. Knowing who we are in God is the beginning of walking with God. Search out these promises in Scripture. Read those texts in the Old and New Testament that tell us about who we really are. The sacrifice that Elijah has created here is set up in a way that there is no doubt that it is God who acts. Not only has he built an altar, not only has he gathered the wood, not only has he put the ox on top, not only has he soaked the whole thing in water, he's set the stage for only one person to be able to do anything. There are no tricks. They're all designed to make clear that there is only one God in Israel, and it is Yahweh. Of course, we've left off the conclusion to the story. Well, that'll be part of the sermon, that when Elijah prays, of course, fire comes down from heaven, consumes the sacrifice of the ox, the wood, the altar, and it says it licked up all of the water. Now, just focus for now on how confident Elijah is that Yahweh will act. This is key to the story, that there's not a moment where Elijah does not believe that Yahweh is attentive, present, not far off, not on an adventure, not asleep, present. And it's a truth we must hear as well, that God is always with us and can overcome every obstacle in our lives, just like that soaking wet burnt offering. Passages has moved to a new podcast host on the FFMC podcast. Please subscribe to the FFMC podcast using your favorite podcasting app. The separate podcast for Passages that you may have been listening to, you may have been subscribed to, that podcast will be closing at the end of September this year. So please migrate to the FFMC podcast as soon as you can. I'd also encourage you to visit the FFMC's website, ffmc.org, First Free Methodist Church, to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.